Welcome back to Bookish Dives. Great to have you with us again. If you've joined us before, well, this isn't our first exploration into some really impactful books.
Good of you diving in again.
Yeah. So today we're tackling a true cornerstone of strategic thought, Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
A big one. Absolutely foundational.
It really is. And our mission today, essentially, is to unpack the core wisdom from these ancient texts. We'll be looking at the excerpts we have and, trying to understand the historical context around them.
Which is crucial for this text.
Right. Now, you might immediately think, okay, military manual? Warfare.
That's the common perception, yeah.
But what's, I think, really fascinating and maybe surprising for some listeners is how these insights just resonate way beyond the battlefield.
Oh, completely. Negotiation, business strategy, even just problem-solving day to day.
Exactly. Understanding competition, planning. The lessons are, well, surprisingly universal. And there are quite a few ways to approach this text, different sources available.
For sure. Historical records, various interpretations over the centuries, scholarly debates. It's rich.
Okay, so let's start with the person, the enigma maybe, Sun Tzu himself. Who actually was this figure?
Yes, the million-dollar question, almost. And, well, the answer isn't totally straightforward.
Okay.
Our most significant early account, the one people usually point to, comes from Sima Qian. He was a major historian writing quite a bit later, actually.
Right.
But he firmly believed Sun Wu, that's the name he uses, existed and served Prince Guang of Wu. So you've got this really strong early authority saying, yes, he was real.
Okay, so that sounds fairly conclusive then.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the wrinkle. There's this other major historical record, the Zhongchuante. It covers the exact period Sun Tzu was supposed to be active. A huge, detailed chronicle. And guess what?
No mention of him.
Not a whisper. Complete silence. And that absence in a major contemporary source, well, it's made a lot of scholars doubt the traditional story.
Wow. Okay, so the historical reality of Sun Tzu, the person, is actually still debated. That's a key point, right?
It really is. A bit of a mystery. But, regardless of whether the biography is spot on.
The text itself, The Art of War, it's had this massive impact anyway, right?
Undeniably. Huge. Military thinkers across Chinese history, they saw Sun Wu as the father of their art, the absolute starting point for strategic thinking.
The originator.
Exactly. And crucially, many scholars who might question the biographical details, they still absolutely accept the text's antiquity. Its age isn't really in dispute in the same way.
Okay. So they separate the person from the work, potentially?
Precisely. They might say, look, we're not sure about Sima Qian's story, but they acknowledge the text itself is very old and very influential.
So the book could be genuinely ancient, even if the author's identity is a bit fuzzy?
That's a good way to put it. And dating the text itself, that's another whole area of study.
How do they approach that?
Well, there are passages inside The Art of War that mention the rivalry between the states of Wu and Ye.
Okay, specific historical conflict.
Right, and those references act as pretty strong clues, suggesting the text likely emerged during that specific period, that conflict.
Which gives us a time frame.
It does.
Yeah.
And it leads to a fascinating potential irony, historically speaking.
Oh.
You might have had China's, quote, most illustrious man of peace, some prominent philosopher advocating for peace back then, living at the exact same time as its, quote, greatest writer on war.
Wow. The philosopher of peace and the master strategist contemporaries. That's quite the juxtaposition.
Isn't it just? Really makes you think.
Okay, so shifting from the author to the text itself, has it changed much over the centuries? Has The Art of War stayed consistent?
Remarkably so in its core structure, this idea of the 13 chapters, that framework seems to have persisted across different eras.
Really? That structure is ancient.
It appears so. Even when early writers quoted it or referred to it, they often seem to be working with something like those 13 chapters. Sima Qian himself mentioned it was widely circulated in his day.
That consistency kind of speaks volumes about its perceived value, I suppose?
I think it does. And we even find bits and pieces, sometimes whole sections, embedded in much older collections, like Tuyu's Tengtian or the big imperial encyclopedia, the Taiping Yulan.
So it was being quoted and preserved in other major works early on?
Exactly. Now, sometimes those fragments are mixed with other commentary, making it tricky, but they give us invaluable glimpses into the text's early forms and show how important it was considered.
It sounds like figuring out the original text is complicated.
Oh, absolutely. You had scholars like Sun Tzu back in the 18th century doing incredible work comparing different versions, trying to sort of reconstruct a reliable text.
A recension, right.
Right. But the honest truth is, finding a truly pristine, perfect original version, probably impossible after all this time. What's more important, maybe, is this continuous effort, this engagement with the text over centuries.
And it wasn't just scholars digging into it, was it? You mentioned military thinkers.
Not at all. You had influential commentators throughout history, like Cao Kung early on, then later Tu Mu, adding their interpretations, their layers of understanding.
Would they always agree?
Ha! Definitely not. That's part of the richness.
Huh.
You had debates. Tu Mu, for instance, criticized Cao Kung's earlier commentary for being too obscure, too hard to grasp.
Okay.
But then others found Tu Mu himself maybe a bit too long-winded. So these discussions just show how much depth there is to grapple with.
And beyond the commentators.
Oh, yeah. Famous generals, real practitioners of war like Han Xin or the celebrated Yue Fei, they were known to be serious students of Sun Tzu.
So practical application.
Absolutely. And even, interestingly, literary figures. Su Sun, who was the father of the famous poet Su Tongpo, he actually wrote about military matters, drawing explicitly on Sun Tzu's ideas.
Wow, so its influence really did spread far and wide, military, scholarly, even literary circles.
Across the board and throughout Chinese history, a truly enduring work.
Okay, let's dive into some of those core ideas then. One thing that seems maybe paradoxical is this common image of China as a historically peace-loving nation set against a text entirely focused on war. How do those fit together?
That's a really critical point to unpack, and it's complex. You definitely have that strong philosophical thread emphasizing peace in Chinese thought.
Right, Confucianism, Taoism.
Exactly. But at the same time, if you look at the actual history, well, it's filled with warfare. Constant conflicts, massive defensive works like the Great Wall. War was a major part of the reality.
So it's not as simple as just peace-loving.
Not really. Perhaps that emphasis on peace comes from a deep, hard-won understanding of just how devastating war is. Sun Tzu himself is very clear about the costs, the suffering involved.
So maybe it's less a contradiction and more like understanding the terrible nature of war makes you value peace more.
That's certainly one way to look at it. And historically, within Chinese thought itself, you had arguments for military strength too.
Yeah.
Not just glorifying war, but seeing it as necessary sometimes.
Oh, so?
As a way to punish aggression, maybe, or to restore order, maintain peace, ultimately, or just as a natural response to, human conflict.
Okay.
But then you also had thinkers who strongly condemned warfare, seeing weapons as inherently evil or immoral.
So a real tension there.
A definite tension. Tu Mu, one of the commentators we mentioned, had an interesting take. He defined war essentially as a form of punishment, almost like a police action, placing it within the legitimate functions of government.
Huh. Like another tool of statecraft.
Kind of. But there was also this tendency, particularly among the governing scholarly class, to sometimes downplay or even avoid military topics. A sort of intellectual looking down on it.
Really, dismissing military theory.
Yeah, some scholars viewed it as useless theorizing, or maybe even immoral to focus on. So it's a complex picture, this relationship with war and strategy.
That's much more nuanced than the simple stereotype. Okay, let's get into the core strategic framework. Sun Tzu outlines these 5 constant factors, right, for analyzing a situation.
Yes, absolutely fundamental. The 5 constant factors: the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline. Think of them as his checklist for assessing any strategic landscape.
Okay, let's break those down. First one, moral law. What does that mean here?
Right, and it's not quite morality as we might think of it today. It's about the harmony, the unity between the ruler and the people.
Ah, okay.
Are the people completely aligned with the ruler? Do they trust the leadership so much that they'll follow them into any danger, face death alongside them without flinching? That's moral law.
So it's about internal cohesion, popular support being a core strength.
Absolutely, a fundamental strength. If you have that, you're already formidable.
Gotcha. Second factor, heaven. Sounds a bit abstract.
It refers to the broader environmental conditions: night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons, the weather, basically the temporal and atmospheric environment you're operating in.
So understanding the natural cycles, the climate.
Exactly. The key insight is you need to work with these factors, not against them. Understand the seasons, the weather patterns, the time of day, and use them. Don't launch a winter campaign unprepared for the cold, for
Makes
instance.
perfect sense. Okay, third factor, Earth. This must be the terrain.
Precisely. Earth covers the physical geography, distances near or far. Is the terrain dangerous or secure? Open ground or narrow passes, high ground, low ground, all of that.
And the takeaway is,
Know the ground intimately. Understand its features, the advantages and disadvantages it offers, and use that knowledge strategically. Terrain isn't passive. It shapes the conflict.
right, you have to master the geography. Okay, fourth, the commander. This is about leadership.
Yes, the qualities of the general or leader. Sun Tzu lists 5 key virtues: wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness.
So it's a blend of qualities.
A crucial blend. You need the wisdom to plan, sincerity or integrity to be trusted, benevolence or care for your soldiers' welfare, the courage to act decisively, and the strictness to enforce discipline. It's a demanding package.
It really is. A failure in one could be critical.
Absolutely. And the 5th factor ties into that: method and discipline.
What does that cover?
This is about the nitty-gritty of organization, how the army is structured, the chain of command, the ranks, but also logistics, supply lines, managing expenditure, controlling resources.
So the organizational backbone.
Exactly. The insight is that without sound organization and reliable logistics, even the best general with the most loyal troops fighting on favorable terrain under perfect weather, well, they'll still fail. Structure and supply are vital.
Okay, so those 5 moral law, heaven, earth, commander, method, and discipline, they're the essential analysis points before you even think about conflict.
That's the idea. Understanding these thoroughly allows you to forecast, with some accuracy, victory or defeat.
Now, probably the most famous line from Sun Tzu, all warfare is based on deception. Let's unpack that.
Yes, fundamental, absolutely central to his entire philosophy. Deception isn't just a tactic, it's the foundation.
What does it mean in practice?
It means constantly misleading your enemy about your intentions, your strength, your weaknesses, your movements, your position, everything.
Appear weak when strong, strong when weak, that kind of thing.
Exactly that. Make them think you're far when you're near, near when you're far. Sow confusion. The core idea is that victory often comes not through sheer force, but through clever manipulation of the enemy's perception. Outthink them.
It's a mental game as much as a physical one.
Very much so. And this links directly to another key principle,
Mm-hmm.
the immense importance of planning and calculation before you act.
Doing your homework first.
Thoroughly. Sun Tzu argues that many victories are actually won or lost in the planning phase, before any fighting starts. Careful assessment, calculation of odds, anticipating the enemy. That's where success begins. Foresight is paramount.
It seems like he really wanted to minimize the actual fighting, the bloodshed.
Oh, absolutely. He was acutely aware of the terrible costs of war, the drain on resources, the loss of life, the disruption to society.
So his strategies aim for efficiency.
Maximum efficiency. He constantly emphasizes aiming for swift, decisive victory. Why? To avoid exhausting your own state, depleting your treasury, wearying your people, and potentially opening yourself up to attack from other rivals who see you weakened.
Right. Protracted wars are dangerous on multiple fronts.
Exactly. He has that famous line, something like, "There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare," or "Cleverness has never been seen associated with long delays." Speed is crucial.
So get in, achieve the objective, get out, minimize the damage.
That's the ideal. He even talks about the practicalities, like foraging on the enemy for supplies.
To reduce the burden on your own supply lines.
Precisely. Use the enemy's resources to sustain your campaign, lessening the economic strain on your own people and state. He paints a really stark picture of how prolonged campaigns can bankrupt a nation.
It's a very pragmatic, almost economic view of war's impact.
It is. And related to that, he stresses rewarding your soldiers well, especially those who capture enemy equipment or achieve victories.
Why is that important?
It incentivizes the right kind of action, capturing resources, fighting effectively, achieving those quick wins he values so highly. It keeps morale up and aligns their interests with the state's.
Makes sense. Now, what about something like siege warfare? Attacking fortified cities seems like a standard part of war.
Well, interestingly, Sun Tzu is strongly against it whenever possible. He sees sieges as generally a terrible idea.
Really?
The cost. He argues that preparing siege engines, building mounds, all of that takes months. The actual assault leads to huge casualties. It's incredibly time-consuming and resource-intensive. His ideal is always to subdue the enemy without fighting if possible. Through strategy, diplomacy, breaking their alliances, disrupting their plans, capture their cities intact, overthrow their kingdom without lengthy campaigns. That's the pinnacle of skill for him. Avoiding the bloody siege is a major strategic goal.
So find ways around that costly, protracted fight.
Exactly. Which leads to another point. Knowing your own strength and the enemy's.
Knowing when to fight and when not to.
Precisely. You have to realistically assess the situation. If you're outnumbered or outmatched, don't just blindly attack. Know when to avoid battle, when to withdraw, when to seek a more advantageous position. He's very clear that a smaller force, if consistently pitted against a much larger one, without clever strategy, will eventually be overcome.
So pragmatism again. Don't bite off more than you can chew unless you have a plan.
Right, and this is where the general's role is so vital. He calls the general the bulwark of the state.
Meaning the nation's security rests on their shoulders.
Directly. If the general is competent, the state is strong. If the general is weak or flawed, the state is vulnerable. Good leadership is absolutely indispensable.
So tying some of this together, what does Sun Tzu consider the absolute highest form of skill in warfare?
It comes back to what we just touched on. The highest excellence is to win without actually fighting, to break the enemy's resistance without engaging in pitched battle.
Through planning and maneuver.
Exactly. Through superior strategy, intelligence, positioning, maybe psychological pressure, so that the enemy realizes fighting is futile, or they're defeated before the main clash even happens.
Making their defeat inevitable beforehand?
Yes. He uses this analogy. It's not a sign of great strength to lift an autumn hare, meaning something very light, or see the sun and moon. Those are obvious things.
Okay.
True skill is like seeing the thunderbolt before it strikes, achieving victory where it seems easy to the uninformed observer because you've already created an overwhelming advantage through subtle means.
Like a perfectly disciplined army facing a completely demoralized, routed enemy, the outcome is already decided.
That's the idea. The ultimate victory is clean, efficient, and ideally bloodless, achieving your strategic aims through superiority of mind and position, not just brute force.
That's a powerful concept. Okay, let's talk about managing large armies. That seems incredibly complex. How does Sun Tzu approach it?
He argues, perhaps counterintuitively, that managing a large force is fundamentally the same principle as managing a small one.
How can that be?
It comes down to organization and communication, breaking the large force down into smaller units using clear signals, gongs, drums, flags, banners to direct them effectively. It's about subdivision and clear signaling.
So organization makes complexity manageable.
Precisely. And tactically, he introduces these crucial concepts of the direct method called Cheng and the indirect method Qi.
Cheng and Qi, direct and indirect.
Yeah. Think of the Cheng as the main expected force, the straightforward attack or defense. The Qi as the surprise element, the flanking maneuver, the feint, the unconventional tactic.
Okay, the 1-2 punch.
Kind of. But he says the combinations of Cheng and Qi are endless, like a circle. You use them together, unexpectedly, to keep the enemy off balance. The insight is that combining the orthodox with the unorthodox creates infinite possibilities.
So it's about flexibility and surprise.
Exactly. He uses these really vivid similes. The force of a well-led attack should be like a torrent of water rushing down a mountain. The timing should be precise and sudden, like a falcon striking its prey.
Powerful imagery.
It is. He also talks about using the appearance of disorder to lure the enemy in, seeming confused or fearful when you're actually perfectly disciplined and ready.
But that requires real discipline underneath.
Absolutely. Simulated disorder needs real order. Simulated fear needs real courage. Simulated weakness needs real strength. It's high-level deception. There's that great anecdote about the General Pang Chuan being tricked.
What happened there?
His rival gradually reduced the number of cooking fires in his camp each night as he retreated. Pang Chuan saw this and thought the army was deserting and losing strength, so he pursued recklessly.
And walked into a trap.
Exactly. Deceived by the appearance of weakness. Sun Tzu says skillful leaders utilize combined energy. They don't rely on just individual bravery, but on the momentum and positioning of the whole force, like rolling logs or stones down a hill. It's about harnessing potential energy.
Managing the force as a unified, powerful entity.
That's the core idea. Clear communication, adaptability, and the clever use of both direct and indirect methods.
It really emphasizes the psychological dimension too, doesn't it? Managing perceptions.
Hugely important. And that extends to how you deploy your forces on the battlefield itself.
Tactical disposition.
Right. Knowing the ground, as we said, but also being able to concentrate your forces where needed or divide them to cover different areas, all based on the circumstances. Adaptability again.
Like the wind, maybe. unpredictable.
He uses that exact analogy. Effective movement should be like the wind, formless and unexpected. And communication on the field is critical, using those gongs, drums, flags to keep everyone focused, to direct their eyes and ears as one unit, especially in the noise and chaos of battle.
Keeping order amidst chaos.
Yes. And clear orders are essential. Disobedience, even by skilled individuals, can unravel everything. He also has that interesting point about surrounding an enemy.
What's that?
He advises leaving them an outlet, a possible escape route, even if it seems like you could close the ring completely,
Why would you do that?
to avoid making them fight with the desperate courage of cornered animals. A trapped enemy with no hope might fight ferociously. Give them a sliver of hope for escape, and their resolve might weaken. It's psychological insight again.
That's subtle. Very interesting. Now, Sun Tzu mentions 9 variations in tactics. What's that about? Is it like 9 specific moves?
Not really 9 specific moves, no. It's more about the principle of variation. It signifies that tactics must be highly adaptable. There isn't one fixed way to do things. A good general needs countless variations up their sleeve.
So extreme flexibility.
Exactly. He lists situations where you don't do the obvious thing. Roads you shouldn't take, armies you shouldn't attack, towns you shouldn't besiege, ground you shouldn't contest. Even commands from the ruler you might need to disregard if they don't fit the situation on the ground.
Disobeying the ruler. That sounds risky.
It is, but his point is the general on the spot understands the immediate reality better than a distant ruler. The core lesson is, rigid plans break. You must constantly adapt, understand the advantages of varying your tactics, leverage the terrain in unexpected ways.
Okay, and he also warns about faults in a general's character.
Yes, 5 dangerous faults. Recklessness, which leads to destruction. Cowardice, leading to capture. A hasty temper, easily provoked into mistakes. An oversensitivity to honor or shame, making you rash. And finally, excessive compassion or over-solicitude for your men.
Wait, caring too much for your soldiers is a fault.
It sounds strange, but his point is it can make a general hesitant, unwilling to make necessary sacrifices or take calculated risks, leading to worry and vacillation, which can be fatal. Each of these 5 faults, he says, can lead to ruin and the army's defeat. It highlights just how critical the commander's balanced judgment and character are.
A real reminder of the psychological pressures and pitfalls of leadership and conflict.
Definitely. And this ties into his detailed discussion of different types of terrain.
Beyond just earth as a general factor.
Yeah, he gets specific. He outlines various ground types. Accessible ground, entangling ground where it's easy to get in but hard to get out, temporizing ground where neither side gains an advantage by leaving first, narrow passes, precipitous heights, positions far from the enemy.
And each requires a different approach.
Absolutely. On accessible ground, secure the advantageous spots first. In narrow passes, occupy them strongly if you're first, or don't attack if the enemy holds them well. On precipitous heights, get there first and wait for the enemy. It's all about understanding the terrain's implications and acting accordingly. Secure your supply lines.
So the ground itself dictates strategy to a large extent.
It really does. He also warns about what he calls the 6 several calamities that can befall an army.
Calamities?
Yeah, things like flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, rout. And crucially, he says these don't arise from natural causes, but from the faults of the general. It puts immense responsibility on leadership.
High stakes indeed. Then he goes even further with the 9 situations, right? More specific battlefield environments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
9 distinct types of ground or situations you might find yourself in during a campaign. Things like dispersive ground, your home territory where troops might easily scatter. Facile ground, easily penetrated enemy territory. Contentious ground, key strategic locations both sides want. Then open ground, ground of intersecting highways. Serious ground, deep in enemy territory. Difficult ground, mountains, marshes. Hemmed-in ground, where escape routes are few. And finally, desperate ground, where you must fight to survive.
Wow, that's a very detailed classification.
It is. And for each, he gives specific advice. On dispersive ground, don't fight, consolidate. On facile ground, don't halt, press on. On contentious ground, don't attack if the enemy holds it. On hemmed-in ground, use stratagem. On desperate ground, fight.
Fight fire with everything you've got.
Exactly, because there's no other option. He emphasizes rapidity throughout speed is vital in war. Care for your soldiers, he says, but don't overindulge them. Keep them disciplined.
And that idea of putting troops in inescapable positions.
That's linked to desperate ground. Sometimes he suggests a general must deliberately lead soldiers where there's no retreat to ignite their will to survive, to make them fight with utmost ferocity. He uses the analogy of the Shuaijian snake.
Yep.
Yeah, a mythical snake said to live on Mount Chang. If you strike its head, its tail attacks. Strike its tail, its head attacks. Strike its middle, both head and tail attack.
Ah, so perfectly coordinated defense and attack.
Right. That's the ideal coordination he seeks in an army. Everyone reacting together. Set a uniform standard of courage. Leverage the terrain to make up for any weaknesses in your troops.
What about burning boats and breaking cooking pots? That sounds extreme.
It is extreme. It's the ultimate expression of being on desperate ground, deliberately removing any possibility of retreat to force your soldiers to fight to the death or achieve victory. A risky but potentially powerful psychological tactic.
All these situations seem to require incredible awareness from the general.
Absolutely. Situational awareness, adaptability, understanding troop psychology, mastering the terrain, it's all interconnected.
Okay, there's one final major element we need to cover. Intelligence. Spies.
Yes, absolutely crucial. Sun Tzu dedicates the final chapter entirely to this, underscoring its importance.
Why so much emphasis?
Because war is incredibly expensive. He starts the chapter by detailing the immense cost of raising and maintaining a large army, the drain on the state and the people. Protracted campaigns are ruinous.
We touched on that.
Right. And his point is, spending vast sums on war, but begrudging the small expense needed for good intelligence, for knowing the enemy's situation, is the height of folly. Foreknowledge is invaluable.
So intelligence is a cost-effective force multiplier.
The most cost-effective, arguably. He then outlines 5 classes of spies.
5 types.
Yes. Local spies using inhabitants of the enemy district. Inward spies using enemy officials. Converted spies using enemy spies that you've turned. Doomed spies giving your own spies false information to leak, knowing they might be caught, to deceive the enemy. And surviving spies, those who return with information.
Wow, a sophisticated system.
Very. And he discusses how to manage them, maintain close relationships, reward them generously, ensure absolute secrecy. You need intuitive sagacity, benevolence, straightforwardness, but also subtle ingenuity to handle spies effectively.
It sounds like a delicate, high-stakes operation.
Extremely. He mentions some historical examples, though their interpretation is sometimes debated, of rulers using spies and deception to great effect. But the main goal is always knowledge of the enemy.
And which type of spy is most important for that?
The converted spy. The enemy agent you've turned. They often have the best access and insight into the enemy's inner workings. Getting reliable information from them is paramount.
So knowing the enemy inside out is the primary goal of all this espionage.
Absolutely. And Sun Tzu concludes that only the most enlightened rulers and wisest generals, those who truly understand the value of intelligence and know how to use spies effectively, can achieve great results, can move surely towards victory. Information is power.
That's a powerful place to end his treatise, information as the ultimate key.
It really ties everything together. Planning, deception, maneuver, they all rely on good intelligence.
Well, this has been just incredibly insightful. Taking this deep dive into Sun Tzu's The Art of War really shows how much wisdom is packed in there.
It's dense, isn't it?
Definitely. And it's so clear that the lessons, the strategic thinking, it really does go far beyond just the battlefield. Planning, understanding psychology, the critical role of information.
Absolutely. And you can see the enduring relevance, can't you? How these principles might apply as you navigate challenges in your own life, your work, any kind of competitive environment.
It really does give you a lot to chew on. That timelessness of strategic thought. And maybe that final provocative idea to leave folks with. Perhaps the paradox of needing to understand war deeply in order to truly value and achieve peace. Or just how crucial knowing yourself and knowing your opponent, whatever form that takes, really is.
Powerful ideas to consider, certainly. We've only scratched the surface today, really.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and guiding us through this.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to revisit Sun Tzu.
And thank you, for joining us on this bookish dive. We really hope this exploration was insightful and got you thinking. If you enjoy these kinds of deep dives and want daily summaries exploring impactful literature, please do make sure you follow Bookish Dives.
We'll be back soon with another book.
We will indeed. Until next time.